The Retroid Pocket 3 is an impressive piece of kit for the dollars, but it does have some strange design choices. Starting at $120 US plus shipping, it's available in various color schemes. I grabbed the Super NES inspired handheld, which I liked best. The difference between the 2 and 3GB RAM model is only $10, so I definitely recommend getting that one. The Retroid Pocket 3 is a bit smaller than a Nintendo Switch Lite. It's also pretty thin, and my larger hands found it reasonably comfortable to hold. I prefer thicker handhelds, but overall it's pretty good, and the build quality of my unit is solid with no creaks. The D-pad is good, but we've seen better, such as with the Anbernic RG353P I reviewed earlier. Analog stick placement is also not too bad. While the analog sticks share similarities with the ones found on a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con controller, these feel a little easier to use. And the R3 and L3 buttons aren't easily clicked in, which is the way I like it. The face buttons are small, like on a PS Vita, but the spacing between them is good, and I didn't have an issue with pressing the wrong button. You might have noticed there's no start and select buttons on the face of the handheld. You'd expect them maybe up here, down here, or somewhere near the screen, like a PSP. Nope, they're up here, which is just poor placement. I have a sneaking suspicion these were supposed to be the volume up and down buttons originally, but Retroid couldn't fit the start and select on the face of the handheld, so they put them up here instead. Pretty disappointing. Volume up and down is now found on the side. And there's a home button on the other side, which requires a double press to activate. That's an odd choice for placement of both, but I didn't press them accidentally during my testing, so I guess it's okay. The shoulder buttons have a decent tactile feel, and the L2 and R2 feel almost like triggers. On top, there's also a micro HDMI port next to the power button, but it only outputs at 720p. It would have been nice to see 1080p, which would avoid blur from upscaling on the majority of TVs and monitors. Underneath is the micro SD card slot and a USB-C charging port. A USB-C charging cable is included with the Retroid Pocket 3, as is a screen protector, and if you pre-order in September, you'll also get a DIY conductive rubber kit for those that don't like the clicky style buttons. You also need to buy a micro SD card for storage if you don't have one already. There's a very nice 4.7 inch 16:9 IPS touchscreen, which is great for the widescreen stuff. I mostly play the older 4x3 retro titles, so with the black borders, it's actually not that much bigger than the 3.5 inch screen found on, say, the Anbernic RG353P. Retroid Pocket 3's IPS screen has an odd resolution of 750p, but it works well, and you can scale games in most emulators to your liking. For 2D stuff, I prefer integer scaling if I notice some pixel warping, but for 3D, I always go full screen. The display has really nice color reproduction, viewing angles, and it's pretty bright. It's better than I expected for the price. Oh, and the bezel is nice and small for once. The 32GB of eMMC storage stores Android 11. I personally don't like Android for retro gaming at all. It's an OS created for phones to be used with a touchscreen, and I think it just doesn't translate well to navigate with a controller. Unfortunately, there's no dual boot option, which would be ideal. Android is also slow to boot on the Pocket 3, so once you boot up, you'll want to use the sleep mode, but that does slowly drain your battery. So there's a trade-off. The Retroid Pocket 3 does require a lot of setting up before you start playing. It's not just plug and play. The OS does allow you to install some emulators straight up, but you'll want to grab the latest versions from the App Store, and then set each one up individually. Retroid also includes their launcher, which does streamline this a bit, but it certainly isn't as quick and easy as something like GelOS on the RG353P. The Retroid launcher does allow you to add a bunch of emulators, scan games on your SD card, and download the cover art, which works pretty well most of the time. Some games you'll have to manually download covers for. The launcher is pretty good overall, but for me, it couldn't quite shake that Android app feeling. So if you don't like retro gaming on Android, I don't think this will change your mind. The included CPU has a surprising amount of power for the dollars. PlayStation runs great. N64, no problem. Everything runs nice using Mupen 64 Plus. Dreamcast and PSP is where we start reaching the limit. For Dreamcast, most of the library will run at full speed. The Flycast emulator also has a bunch of widescreen hacks, making it perfect for the 16:9 screen. However, Dreamcast runs at native resolution, and while it looks really good, 1.5 res scaling makes it look even nicer, but unfortunately runs too slow. Anyway, at native res, it's still a good way to enjoy the Dreamcast. The majority of PSP games will work at native resolution, which upscaled on this screen doesn't look the nicest, but it's still pretty decent. Some games, like Daxter, can run at twice the resolution and look really good. This would have been the best way to play PSP. And then there's the really difficult games to emulate, like MotorStorm Arctic Edge, which isn't playable even at native res. Even with frame skip, this isn't going to be a nice experience. Finally, I tried some streaming with Moonlight. It works great. Very little input lag, and the image quality is high. It's not the way I'd play these games, but for those interested in streaming, it works really well. The speakers are also decent. There's no bass, of course, but that's to be expected. Finally, I tested the unit's battery life. I had the sound up about 3/4, Wi-Fi connected, and brightness on full, playing a Dreamcast game for a worst case scenario test. The 4000 mAh battery lasted for 5 hours and 33 minutes from a full charge, before completely shutting off. That's pretty good battery life there. So, the Retroid Pocket 3 is a very good, affordable handheld. The screen is excellent. Battery life is great. The controls are pretty good. But the placement of the start and select buttons especially, it's flawed. If you don't mind Android OS, this is a no-brainer. While I will stick to the Anbernic RG353P for my 4x3 content, this is the best 16:9 handheld in this price range. For widescreen Dreamcast, PSP and streaming, it's a winner. Also, be sure to check my Anbernic RG353P review to see how that compares, as it's also a really good 4x3 retro handheld. Cheers!